All right, leading our webinar today is Dr. Lisa Micou. Dr. Micou is a partnership manager at Aperture Education and comes to us today with a wealth of expertise from several different roles within the education space. Lisa, welcome. Take it away.
Hi there. How are you all? It is so wonderful to see you all again. And I do think that there are some people that I've engaged with before in our first webinar, and some of you are here for the first time, so welcome. Last time we had an amazing conversation with Bernie ISD in Texas about how they used the MTSS framework to support their students to reclaim learning after the pandemic. Today, we're focusing specifically on data. Data and how we use it to make great things happen for kids is a professional passion of mine. I especially love that light bulb moment that educators have when they experience the power of using data to make actionable decisions that lead to real change in their classrooms. Now, just as a reminder, our goals for today's webinar are to identify and explore useful and meaningful sources of school data for social emotional success, to identify questions that you need to answer and why they're important, and to explore different types of data and reflect on gaps in your data sources based on what you need to know. However, let's do a quick recap of the preview slide deck that we sent out prior to today. Do not worry if you are thinking I didn't watch it. I should have watched it. No worries. We're going to do a quick recap. However, if you do have that slide deck that we sent out earlier handy, we will be asking you a question based on that. So please make sure that you are ready. So let's do that quick recap. There we go. So during the recording, you heard me talk about how educators and school leaders may have experienced data as a source of stress, anxiety, and even disappointment by way of accountability, rather than a source of empowerment to truly drive instruction and make positive change for kids, for staff, for families. We refocused our thinking then on data that would support student social and emotional success, which meant that we needed to review what systemic SEL looks like in order to know what data would be helpful to zero in on. We reviewed that systemic SEL comes down to teaching, practicing, and generalizing social and emotional skills on which we can use data to either directly measure growth of those skills or indirectly see the impact of those skills. We also reviewed the evidence of impact for implementation of systemic SEL, such as increases in social and emotional competence or skills, decreases in negative behaviors and emotional distress, and increases in academic engagement and performance. I then asked you to brainstorm possible sources of data that would measure each of these areas of impact. So hopefully you got a chance to brainstorm prior to today about the types of data sources that are available within a school division or district that would speak to social and emotional impact. We have a lot of really great ideas. We have something under every category. That's awesome. So there are a lot of ideas here. Please feel free to keep adding to our Padlet as we're talking. If something occurs to you, by all means, keep adding that. All right. So now that we've had a chance, let me go back to my slide deck. So now that you've had a chance to brainstorm data sources for social and emotional success, I want to give you an opportunity to hear from a district leader who has also done this work. Jayme Gaudet is currently the Social Emotional Learning Coordinator for Colchester School District in Vermont. She earned her master's degree in education with a focus in applied behavior analysis. She's worked for Colchester School District for 10 years as a behavior specialist, and more recently as the district SEL coordinator. And Jayme previously worked for 13 years at Vermont's local mental health agency. And she's provided training on numerous behavioral health topics and has consulted with and led districts and programs in systems changes and development. Welcome, Jayme.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here this afternoon.
It's so awesome to have you with us. So, Jayme, as the SEL coordinator, what data sources did you guys rely on in Colchester to determine the social and emotional success of your students, and why those?
We started working, really looking at data in the regards to academics and nurse visits, as well as further on down the road. Most of our school buildings adopted Swiss as a data resource. And we started using those because it gave us information about who was coming to school, who wasn't coming to school, what behaviors were happening and where, and by whom and how frequent through our Swiss data. And then obviously our academic data and where kids are, what needs they have, what strengths they have, and where we need to continue to support them in their academic growth.
So why those? Why were they important? What did they connect to for your district?
Well, I think the most obvious is academic. That's why we're here, is to educate our students. Nurse and Swiss, I believe we really use those because we wanted to know why kids were out of the classroom, why behaviors were happening, where they were happening, and what kind of responses that we needed to. That also led to us educating and supporting our teachers and faculty and staff on how to support them in responding to those behaviors. Nurse data, I think, is everyone's attempt to engage in kind of those internalizers, or students who are internalizers and have worries, but doesn't come out in more of your behavioral data, but more in a worry or physical ailment.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the data that you were able to access and use is that some of the things that you mentioned, other people already had thought about those, and those are data sources that they have readily available in their district. But some of them I even forgot, like the nurse visits, thinking about students who leave the classroom and thinking about how often they're leaving the classroom is a great source of data, but it's not necessarily one that people often think about. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that we marked like when kids were leaving, and we could go back and look at that. We have grown that over the years in different buildings around what kind of information do we need to take, and what kind of response do we need to have when kids are coming to the nurses. So we have to meet a need, not reinforce a new need, and support a student and where they are in their well-being.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing that reflection with me. Hopefully other people, this has gotten other people to thinking about different data sources that maybe they didn't initially think about. So again, as you are collecting, again, we're trying to collect collaborative knowledge on that Padlet. So as you all are trying to think of other data sources, please feel free to add that to our Padlet. So thank you so much, Jayme.
Yeah, and Lisa, if I could just also add, many things that were on the Padlet were as well areas such as check-in, check-out in Chico, and we definitely used all of those. We didn't at the beginning, but we were able to kind of incorporate them into what we were doing to say, hey, this is what can support students universally. This is for the students who need a little bit more. And then I think there were individualized plans and FBAs that we also use within our districts based on the need and what that data was telling us.
Awesome. Awesome. Sometimes when you start to think about those things, it's helpful to, again, create that knowledge together, because sometimes we have data sources that we don't even realize that we have, or we just forget that we have them.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for, again, doing that reflection with us and helping us to really capture that thinking together. So, as you can probably see, all of those different data sources that we just uncovered are all some kind of assessment. And I'm seeing in the chat, oh, Kyla, we're only able to see our responses. So let me fix that at some point. I'll make sure that we all have access to everybody's responses. I'll make sure I fix that when we share that back out. But all those different data sources are all some kind of assessment. So what is an assessment? Well, an assessment refers to the wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, learning progress, skill acquisition, or educational needs of students. We assess to gather data that gives us a clearer picture of what's going on. We then use that data to inform our next steps. Assessments, though, fall into two buckets: standardized and non-standardized. A standardized assessment is any form of assessment that, number one, requires all test takers to answer either the same or, better yet, alternate equivalent questions. Number two, the assessment is administered in the same way each time. And number three, the assessment is scored in a standard or consistent manner. Now, the benefit of a standardized assessment is that it allows you to measure growth on identified skills over time reliably and with accuracy. It makes it possible for you to confidently measure growth over time for individual students or groups of students. There are many types of standardized assessments, but some types of standardized school assessments might include tools such as like the COGAT or academic assessments like EasyCBM. It includes some social emotional assessments, such as standardized behavior ratings, like the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, or DESA. Now, non-standardized assessments include everything else that doesn't meet those three requirements. Non-standardized assessments can give you formative information regarding things like whether skills in that moment have been mastered, like you might see on an exit ticket, or how someone might feel about something, like on a survey. But because they are missing those three key components of standardization, non-standardized assessments are often limited in their ability to measure reliable growth over time. Types of non-standardized assessments include sources such as behavior referral data, or sometimes surveys. The reason that this is important is because different types of data can allow you to answer different types of questions. So, what type of social emotional questions are you asking about students and why? Well, you may be asking questions like, what percentage of my students have the social and emotional skills necessary to be successful academically, socially, and emotionally? Or maybe what percentage of my students might need additional social and emotional support? Well, these are questions related to proactive prevention, because we may be planning for how many student service personnel to budget for the next school year. You may be asking questions like, for students who need more social and emotional support, how can we most effectively support them? Where do we start? These are questions related to intervention, because perhaps we're focused on allocation of time for direct and indirect service for students. And finally, you may be asking questions like, are students making significant growth in their social and emotional skills? Is that growth showing up in their academic performance? Well, these are questions related to growth and impact, because we're all focused on the ultimate educational goal, like Jayme mentioned, of helping students graduate on time. Most of the questions we ask, though, related to social emotional well-being of students comes down to a direct question of social emotional competence or the impact of that social emotional competence. The type of assessment we would need to answer those questions is dependent on how high stakes the outcome is. If I'm wondering if today's lesson made students feel that their voice was heard, I may only need a non-standardized quick survey. If I'm asking questions related to fiscal resources, impact, growth over time, I'll want a standardized assessment to show impact to my stakeholders. So now let's hear from Jayme about the kinds of questions the Colchester team was asking and why. And while we're talking, feel free to use the chat to make connections to your own district as you hear Colchester's experience. Hi, Jamie. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So as the SEL coordinator, again, the question is, what kinds of questions were you all asking in Colchester about student social emotional well-being? And where were those questions stemming from?
Yeah, I can speak to this, and it was a conversation that has always happened in Colchester School District, even pre-pandemic. But as we all know, the pandemic kind of pushed us to bring it alive and really dive deeper into it. And we had some behavioral data in regards to office behavioral referrals, and we were responding to those in regards to programming and behavior programming and reinforcement plans and motivational tasks and prevention. But we weren't, and we were responding to the behavior, but we weren't seeing as much of a robust change as we really wanted to see within our data, and meaning our students having some skills and seeing a reduction in behavioral data that was coming through all of our offices. And so it really came down to like, okay, we have these in place, but if they're not moving anything, the why. And so then we started diving a little deeper about why are these kids engaging in these behaviors? What do we need to do? And so when we started asking the why is when we got to the part of that kids and people don't just behave a certain way for the outcome of it. It's also because of the skill set, and what skill set do we each bring to the table that we have and that we don't have. And we didn't have a way to measure that. We were really good at making relationships with kids. We were really good at showing that we were here for all kids. But we needed to, and we acknowledged that it needed to be a goal of ours, that we needed to know what was it that they needed. And none of the data that we had really showed us that. It showed us there was a need, and sometimes it showed us what support we were putting in place was or wasn't working, but we still weren't teaching the skill because we didn't know exactly what the skill was. And so I don't know if this is jumping ahead or not, but this is where it was like, we need some areas around what is it that we expect from kids? And then how do we measure what skills they have? And then what skills do we need to teach? And so we want to know that for all of our students, whether or not they're a student that show up in behavioral data through a Swiss, whether or not it shows up in a nurse visit, or if a student is academically struggling, why is that student academically struggling? If it's because of a need and a deficit in their academics, then we have a procedure to do that and how to support kids. But oftentimes it corresponds with a deficit in a social emotional learning goal area. And if we can meet that need, it makes a student more available to actually meet other expectations, whether or not it's academic and curriculum and or behavior and relationships.
So one of the things I love about the picture that you just painted is the fact that, you know, sometimes when we talk about social emotional skills and needs, a lot of times we focus on the kids who do show up on our Swiss or behavior referral data. One of the things from my experience is thinking about the kids who sometimes go to the nurse, and you start to see increases in nurse visits, might be our kids who are in our gifted classes, or kids who are just high achieving, and maybe they don't show up on other data, but they might show up on this data because they're having feelings. They just don't know what to do with those feelings. And so the easiest thing to do might be to go to the office for a stomach ache.
Yeah, and our kids might have the same deficit in a competency area, but show it in different behaviors. And one student might show it in a worry, and another student might show it in more of an externalizing behavior that they engage in. But really, we got to look at the skill and what skill needs to be taught. And we didn't have a way to look at that. And now in Colchester School District, we do, and we are. And that's exciting. And we are in our second year of fully implementing DESA and our first year of fully integrating second step as explicitly teaching instruction to our students pre-K through 8, which is awesome.
So I love the fact that one of the things that you're really hitting on is hitting on the meeting the needs of the whole child and meeting the needs of all kids, which is sometimes difficult and challenging for a district to do. So thank you for that.
I think the other thing that this assessment has given us as a resource for all faculty and staff is not everybody understands what social emotional learning is and what it does and how you use it and the impact that it has. And it's allowing us all to grow because we're thinking about it, we're asking those questions, we're understanding the cause and effect of having a lagging skill in a competency area and how it impacts others in our space. And that goes for our students and our faculty and staff.
Awesome. All right, so this was Colchester's learner-centered problem based on their noticings and wonderings about their data. So now we're going to take a few minutes to allow you to collaborate with other district leaders. We're going to randomly assign you to breakout rooms. Once there, make sure to introduce yourself with your name, your state, your division, your role. Your group will document your ideas on a Jamboard. I'll show you that in just a second. So make sure that when you get into the room, you identify a note taker. Now, remember what you're discussing is what social emotional questions are you asking about students and why? What have you noticed in your data? All right, let's take a look at that Jamboard. So when you get into the Jamboard, what you'll notice is that there is a slide for each group. So when you go into your breakout room, make sure you pay attention to what group you're in. If you've never used a Jamboard before, all you need to know is that to add text, you just click on a Post-it, add your response, click Save, and it will automatically populate. And you can make as many Post-its as you want. Let me go ahead and get rid of mine. You can make as many Post-its as you want. I've given you an example to start off your thinking. You'll have about 4 minutes to discuss and document your thinking. All right, welcome back. Some great conversations. I can see people having good in-depth conversations. I know it's not a whole lot of time, but I just thank you so much for taking the time to collaborate and be transparent with each other. Feel free to continue to add thoughts if you didn't quite get to finish before we brought you back. You have access to that Jamboard, so you can feel free to put some more ideas in there. Let's at least get one share out, some ideas that you guys talked about. Just what are some a general summary of the type of questions that you asked about students in terms of their social emotional well-being and why? And I know you had a lot of ideas on slide 2. So someone from group 2, hopefully our note taker, maybe unmute and give us a little summary.
I was the note taker for group 2. Hi, everybody. Alexandra Baker from Aperture. I think one trend that came up in the types of questions that are being asked are around how do we know which students need additional or targeted support and what kind of support do they need? That was a trend that came up in our conversation.
Yeah. I've heard that a lot talking to other districts, and that was always a question that we had in my former district as well. I did see a lot of commonality in terms of looking at skills, whether it's skills on how do we build belongingness with students, how do we teach those skills so that students can build belongingness. I saw some questions about students, especially those little ones, K-2, which I don't know about you, but even in my own school district, that was a highlighted challenge for us. One of the things, though, that typically people ask about is, again, really focusing on directly measuring social emotional skills or assessing its impact. Those are typically the 2 types of questions that we tend to ask about students. So now that you had a chance to reflect on what data sources are available to you and what questions you're asking and why, Let's talk a little about how we use what we have to either answer those questions or identify gaps in our data, and therefore what you might need in order to answer the questions that you have. So in order to make intentional decisions about prevention, intervention, and growth or impact, it all starts with having strong data. What does strong data mean? Well, we're going to dip our toes into psychometrics. Not too deep, I promise, just a little, okay? Two key psychometric principles for being able to interpret data in a statistically sound way include reliability and validity. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure or how precise it is. Now, as we talked about earlier, an assessment that is standardized in terms of administration, test items, and scoring will produce more reliable results compared to non-standardized assessments. So what this means for you is that when assessments have good reliability, you can be confident that the differences in results over time are based on expected differences, like growth on a set of skills, rather than noise in your data, like whether the kid had breakfast that morning or stayed up late the night before studying for a big test. For example, if I'm using a survey and I arbitrarily choose different questions to ask each time, then my results may simply be a reflection of the different questions I asked, rather than growth on an overarching concept like self-management, which is what I wanted to assess. This happens all the time in discipline data. Behavior referrals, much to our chagrin, are a very subjective form of data. They are sometimes the result of the perception or bias of the person writing the referral. So oftentimes with referral data, we may see inconsistencies in our data because rather than reliably measuring a student's ability to know and follow school-wide expectations over time, what we're really seeing are fluctuations in relationships within a school building or inequitable discipline practices. Validity at its core refers to the accuracy of a measure. Does the assessment measure what it is supposed to measure? This requires us to have a confident understanding of what an assessment is supposed to be measuring and whether there's psychometric evidence that it does so. So basically, am I able to answer that question with that data point? Is it measuring what I need it to measure to support students in an actionable way? Well, why is this important? If I'm using data to make fiscal decisions about allocation of resources or decisions about school improvement and accreditation, then I better be certain that that data I'm using is valid for the purpose I need to use it for. So if an assessment is precise or reliable and accurate or valid, this means that I can rely on this data to precisely tell me what I need to know and to accurately show me improvement on that skill or concept over time. So now the question you should be asking is, what do I know about the reliability and validity of the data we are using to make decisions that impact resources, school improvement, and prevention and intervention support for students? What reliable and valid data sources are you missing from what you have? And finally, if this is not your forte, because it isn't for many, what other voices are you inviting to the table to support you in this work? So now let's take a look at some common sources of data we oftentimes include in our examination of student social emotional success and reflect on the type of data it gives and what questions you can answer. Surveys like school climate surveys measure perceptions, feelings, opinions. It's an efficient way to elicit stakeholder feedback. You typically get a rating on what's called a Likert scale, like a 1 to 4 rating. For example, I might get results that say 60% of my students indicate that they only sometimes feel safe at school. Because this is oftentimes a non-standardized type of assessment, it oftentimes does not have strong evidence of reliability and validity. With that data, I can determine if there is a general need, but not necessarily where the need is or why it's happening, the root cause. Perceptions, feelings, and opinions are often an outcome indicator of other things, such as skill development. If you give surveys more than once, you can determine if there's improvement in data, but not necessarily if that improvement is meaningful, making it challenging to use this data for high stakes decisions like allocation of resources. Similarly, behavior referral data provides us with information about the presence or absence of negative behaviors. It's just a raw score count though. We can use it to generally tell us if there's a need and if there's general improvement. And behavior referral data is also an outcome indicator of other things, such as skill development. With a rating scale, such as the DESA, you're able to obtain a reliable and valid assessment of student positive prosocial skills. Having a standard score like a T-score provides meaning and context to data we have because this type of data is interpreted based on a normal curve, or what many know as the bell curve. This gives us information on what a typical score is, and also how far from typical do we need to be in order for it to be significant and meaningful. Therefore, we can use it to determine whether there is a need, where that need is, if there is improvement, whether that improvement is significant and meaningful, and what that rate of improvement is, which allows us to measure impact of programming and determination of actionable next steps. So the types of problems you need to solve will drive the type of data you need. Let's continue our conversation with Jayme about the problems she was trying to solve and how she made determinations about data in order to solve them. Welcome back, Jayme. Oh, unmute. Surprise.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me back. I'm excited to talk about our data. And we had lots of data, right? And data tells a different story depending on what numbers and information you're looking at. In your last slide, Lisa, all of those different types of data collection we've used in our district. Mm-hmm. I think I will start by telling a recent story of working with a school building in our district where teenagers, it's definitely teenagers, and we know that we have to be on our game with teenagers. They want things to be interesting and they want it to be impactful and meaningful. And they were giving us through survey-like assessments information that to us wasn't what we were hoping for. And there was reason behind that, and kids were talking about it and staff were talking about it. And I went to a recent meeting with a team around social emotional learning and presented data, our DESA data. And in our DESA data to that age group, it showed us that we had in self-awareness alone for our middle school, we had a 25% increase in students' ability to use the competency of self-awareness in their day, and teachers were seeing this. We also in social awareness had a 25% increase, and with also kids that had it as a typical, some of those students even moved to a strength, which was awesome. So what I like about what we're doing in this measurement is we're not just looking at the kids with need, we're looking at all students. This is good for all kids, all students, and we're seeing where they're at. And just because you have a strength in one area doesn't mean you do in another area, and doesn't mean you don't have a need there to support. Another data point that I'd like to talk about is as a district as a whole, we moved 30 kids in the past year from having a need to a typical. And that 30 students is a lot. And so maybe we've been able to do that in the past. I don't know. We never had data to see. And to be able to really look as a whole of where people are at. And so that's pretty amazing to look at. And as I'm sharing this data with this team, they were like, oh, can we share more of this with our whole building? So I know, Lisa, you talked about that light bulb moment. That light bulb moment happened with a team for us because we had data that wasn't about me coming as a social emotional learning coordinator and saying, this should happen and this is what we do. And I want it to be successful, because we all have times where we feel that way. But it was instead an opportunity to say, this is what you as educators are reporting out from your data and in reflection. And I think this sometimes can be the difference from the anecdotal data around opinion and versus more data in regards to DESA, which has the scientific approach and it's standardized, which was really exciting. So I wanted to share that example because it was a celebration within our district, and I believe that all people, even if it's hard at the beginning, can get there. And sometimes we have to show and prove it, and that's what data can do for us.
That's awesome.
The other thing that I think data has done for us is really told us, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is it's given us the what. Not just that there's a problem, but it's given us the what is the problem, which feeds how do we prevent, how do we intervene. And so then it allows us to step back and say, okay, here's the what. We need to intervene in these ways. Now, how do we do that? And what do we need to be able to do that? And that's when we talk about using data for our stakeholders and our community, is we have to show them if there's a need, what the need is, versus just saying, hey, our students feel 30% of them aren't excited to come to school. But instead saying, we've been doing this and we've moved 30 students from a need to a typical. What else do we need to do to move the rest of them? What do we need for resources? What do we need for supports? And that's how we can advocate for that. I am not only collecting and sharing data with our faculty and staff, but as well with our board, our school board, to show, hey, this is what we've done with what supports you've given us, and this is what we're continuing to do, and here are our new goals, and we're going to come back and report, and we might need a little more, and we might be asking for some more, and this is why.
I love the picture that you painted of building buy-in with stakeholders without me even asking. That is a true picture of how you build buy-in with people and helping people understand. And I just want to point out, because you snuck that in your description, but she was talking to a group of middle school teachers. And I know a lot of times people go, I got my elementary people on board. How do I get my middle school people on board? Well, you get them on board by helping them to be a part of that process, and you help them by showing them data about the effort that they're putting in and what impact that's having. And then they'll take it from there, which is really awesome.
Yeah. And it was their words that were that was their data that they were giving me, that I was just giving back to them. And so they owned it, and it was something to celebrate, as well as continue to see where the needs are. I think that it also tells us where professional development needs to go. So if there is an area of, I know on the data that's on the screen today, you can see, and I know it's not that big for us who are vision impaired. So you can see in the red where there's more need, and that might be an area in which kids have a deficit and have a need for improvement, but it also might acknowledge a need for improvement that staff have in teaching those skill areas. So it's not just looking at, oh, I have these 15 kids in my school that need support in regards to goal-directed behavior. It might mean that all of our staff and faculty would benefit from more professional development in that competency area so they can support their students.
Awesome. The impact that we see from systemic SEL stems from a person having social emotional competence or skills. So the data that we have available to us in our divisions is either a direct measure of social emotional competence or an indirect outcome of having those skills. When I have a reliable and valid measure of social emotional competence that provides me with strong data, I'm confidently able to answer the question, do students have the social emotional skills they need to be successful behaviorally, emotionally, and academically in order for them to be graduates and productive citizens of your state or commonwealth? And now, here's what I can do about it, depending on my data. If students do not have these skills in their repertoire, we can instruct or intervene proactively. If students do have skills, but they don't demonstrate them as often as they could, then we can provide more practice by intentionally integrating that practice within academic instruction. If students have skills and demonstrate them often, but they don't feel like they have skills, then we can provide more actionable feedback and generalization. So when you have reliable and valid data on your students' social emotional competence, you can then use that information to drive intentional decision-making regarding improvement that you know will lead to successful outcomes. So we've learned a lot today. We've hit on all of those goals that we initially identified. So now it's your turn again. So just take a moment and think. Based on what you learned today, what are you curious to learn more about? Just think for a second. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to put something in the chat as we continue to close out our session. Thank you so much for your time today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to learn more about how Aperture can support your district. I've included some resources for you to use to continue your learning. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kyla to close us out.
All right, everyone, thank you so much. We do have a winner for the trivia question, and the winner is Kathleen Begeni-Johnson. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. So Kathleen, I will send you an email to get a mailing address to send you some swag and a $10 Starbucks gift card. So congratulations. All right. We are going to be sending an email within 24 hours that will have this recording, a copy of the presentation, and the next link for our next session. But I am going to go ahead and drop that in the chat box for us. So our next episode for this series on MTSS is going to be on June 15th. And so if you'd like to go ahead and sign up, you can do so there. This will be a standard webinar, not with breakout rooms, so slightly different format, but we'd love to see you again. All right, thank you, Lisa, for sharing your expertise with us. As always, it's been a pleasure. We appreciate you, Jayme, for sharing your SEL journey with us. And again, kudos to the great success you guys have had, and I know you're going to continue to have. We can't wait to hear more about it. And thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate everything you do for students and the education system. You are extremely appreciated and deserve a fabulous summer break coming up. So on behalf of Aperture Education, thank you everyone and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.